Come on. Welcome into the Autzen Audibles Podcast. Matt Preem, Eric Scopel, Jared Mack. Welcome to the show. It's Monday, December 18th, a couple days before National Signing Day. And it's already kind of getting exciting for Oregon. We talked about on the site on duckterritory.com this weekend that things are Oregon had a big visit weekend with a bunch of transfers on campus. From a portal perspective, they had a couple of their verbal commitments from the high school level on campus, and they're trying to stack pieces onto this roster for the 2024 and beyond seasons. And literally right before we started pressing record on this podcast, a commitment happened. We're going to break that down. We're also going to discuss kind of what else happened this weekend, where things could be going for Oregon this weekend, and more. But so let's start with the commit. Jay Harris. He is an interesting story. I don't know if many people know of him. I didn't know of him until this past week, but he's a Division II All-American running back that I believe has 3 years of eligibility at his next school, which is going to be Oregon. But like I said, he announced on Twitter that he committed Monday morning after taking an official visit this weekend. It's a unique avenue to find a player. I don't know how many of us on our bingo cards had a D2 player committing to Oregon on scholarship. But 6'2", 215 pounds. He's a Division II All-American and 1,400 yards rushing. He scored a touchdown in every single game that he played. It's at least an interesting move. It feels like maybe a guy that could be here for a couple of years. I don't envision him being like a one-and-done type transfer.
Extremely dynamic on film if you go watch him. I mean, he moves really, really well for his size. He looks like an NFL caliber player eventually, at least in terms of what he has physically. Of course, there's a lot you have to see transition to playing at this level, but big, strong, athletic, explosive, can run by everybody on the field. As Matt said, extremely productive. Hate to have been Central Oklahoma on October 7th, 274 yards and 4 touchdowns in that game. That's a lot. As Matt said, like certainly somebody who's not on your radar when the portal starts, because you're not really looking through Division II rosters to try to figure out who a school like Oregon might take. But once you kind of read up on him and you go watch the tape and stuff, you see why this would be somebody Oregon would be interested in. And you also think back now to some of the news we've seen recently with Dante Dowdell entering the transfer portal. I think that's something that's happened since the last time we recorded a podcast. That opened up another spot in the room. We know Bucky Irving is declaring for the NFL draft. I think that's something that's also happened since the last time we recorded a podcast. He will play in the Fiesta Bowl. Just a couple of updates there. But think about this running back room. It's now starting to take shape a little bit more now when you think about it being built around Jordan James, Noah Whittington. See what you have with Jay Harris. You've got Jaden Lamar. You've got DeJuan Riggs, the high school prep running back out of Washington, D.C. committed. He probably will sign in a couple of days. That's somebody we can talk about when we talk about the signing day preview. But the room now at least looks like it's close to full, at least in terms of the numbers you'd like to see for next year with 5, potentially 6, depending on if they make any more moves. I think this is a nice addition. And frankly, I'm really curious to see what this guy looks like when he gets here, just because if you go watch the film, he looks like he should belong. Sometimes you get situations where that's not the case and you bring a kid up and he's not ready. But this guy looks the part. We saw him in Eugene, I think, also on Friday. And just to get physically walking around the facility, you're like, that looks like a Division I running back. So very, very interesting addition. And I think somebody who I wouldn't be surprised if he's their number 3 guy, maybe number 2 if Whittington's not
ready
at perfect health to start a season. I think this kind of a player is just a really nice, I would say, necessity ad, but also a bit of a luxury ad in terms of the fact that he is somebody who can physically come in and help right away.
You mentioned that Central Oklahoma game. in that game, Jay Harris was the only player in all of Division II football this past season with 3 rushing touchdowns of 40 or more yards in the same game. He scored on plays in that game of 15, 64, 45, and 44 yards. And 150 of those, 200 and something yards came on 3 plays. This is it's hard to get like, oh, he's gonna be an all conference player. It's like hard to say that, but it's interesting and it's exciting in the fact that you don't see this. You see FCS to FBS happen all the time. Oregon's had huge success with that, but very rarely do you see a guy go from D2 to not only just FBS but Group of 5 and a team that's playing at a level that Oregon's at where they're expecting a playoff run in 2024. And it's exciting just to see the unknown of how impactful can this guy be? Is this truly one of those diamond in the rough type guys? And it's a completely different position. It's on a different side of the football, but Igor Olshansky, like that was a guy that like nobody knew anything about. And he showed up and he became like one of the Pac-12 or at the time the Pac-10's best defensive tackles out of completely nowhere. And this is, who knows what Jay Harris's career is like, but he's coming from basically out of nowhere.
He's also coming from the state of Missouri, which, not to get too far down the pike here of Dan Lanning connections. Jared, is the story published?
I just hit publish and it disappeared. So I have to completely rewrite it. So that's why I've been silent for the first 7 minutes of this podcast. And I might be silent for the next 7 minutes of the podcast. I'll give a quick
go ahead.
Jay Harris thing. Huge running back, 6'2", 220 pounds, 215. I think he was listed at Northwestern Missouri State. But he's a big boy. He runs downhill. He's very similar to what Oregon has looked at running backs in the past in terms of Bucky and Noah, Jordan James, just athletic guys who can, either beat you with their speed or on the edge or just run right through you. I think it's a very welcome addition in the running back room. I think there are some question marks going into next season. I don't think any of the running backs Oregon has right now are nearly as talented as Bucky. And he was pretty damn good the last 2 years with 1,000 yards each. So I think it's add some depth, solidifies some position. I don't know if there's a lot of expectations for Harris when he comes onto campus. And I'm certainly not going to have too many, but I think that he's going to be a welcome addition. I'm just interested to see what it'll look like going against D1 competition, because it's going to be just a sharp contrast between the level that he was playing at, where he put up, these ridiculous numbers where he's, running for 1,500 yards a season, 1,600s this last year. So it's going to be a completely different culture change and a talent level change, but I think he has the physical traits to do it. He's certainly a lot of fun to watch on film. He's clearly like the most dominant player on the field at points. I don't expect that at Oregon, but if he comes by and proves that he is the most dominant player on the field, it's another good pickup. I think Coach Locke has done a great job in his brief couple of years here of finding and evaluating and bringing in really good talent. So, I trust him on this one. He's a guy who found Bucky, a guy who found Noah. Jordan James obviously was a bigger recruit, but a guy like Jalen Lamar seems like he's got a lot of promise. So it'll be another interesting addition, but I welcome it. I think it'll be a good one.
I'm just curious to see what the backstory is and how somebody with his physical attributes ended up where he did out of high school, right? Because you never know like what the story is. There could have been grades, there could have been stuff away from football, there could have been somebody close to home that he wanted to stay nearby for a little bit. I don't know, but that'll be something to follow, because again, as Jared has said and Matt has said and I have said, you watch him and he looks like a Division I athlete, and he's only spent a couple of years at a Division II school and exploded onto the scene and become one of the best players at that level. And again, you watch him and he looks like he should belong at this level. And just the last thing and the point I was about to make before we learned about the unfortunate news with Jared's story not publishing, I just wonder a little bit of what kind of connections maybe Dan had in that part of the country, in the state of Missouri, to So maybe he knows somebody on that Division II staff that tipped him off and said, "We got something really special down here." I'm just curious a little bit on that background. I'm not sure if Dan will ever go into detail, or if we can get in contact with Jay. Maybe he can kind of outline some of that. But just a really interesting commitment from a couple of different angles, and one that, again, like Jared, I don't know what the expectation should be, but it's certainly a guy who physically looks like he checks some boxes.
Now, it could, by the time we were finished this recording of the podcast, or by the time you listen to this show, because maybe it's a Tuesday morning and you're off to work and you pop this on. I don't know, but there might be other commitments that come from prospects on campus this past weekend. The one most likely, I think, we hinted at this on the site. Matt Zenitz of 24/7 Sports has now made it public that he expects Kobe Savage to go and commit to Oregon. He was on campus this past weekend. Savage has not said anything publicly as of December 18th at 9:25 a.m. But the expectation is, at least, that the Kansas State all-conference player at the safety position should be committing to Oregon in the next day or two, maybe a little bit later. He was at Washington this weekend as well, but Oregon has positioned themselves here for the front runner, at least, to land a commitment. And I think this is another one where maybe you look at it and say, well, it's a 3-star safety. Is this really that big of a deal? And I know some people, strangely enough, had that type of reaction Sunday on the site, but this is an all-conference player 2 years in a row in the Big 12. This is a team captain, one of the team's leaders overall for a Kansas State team that's going to be playing in a bowl game that spent part of the year as a top 25 program. PFF likes Kobe Savage, and it's going to be it would be a piece that would fill a need for Oregon. I mean, Jared's talked about it a lot. Like the safety room's completely barren. He talked about it on his 2D story that he put up on the site today. That, like, even though they've got some guys available, like they need to fill the holes. So this is a big step. This would be a big step in the right direction for filling those holes if they can close the deal here on Kobe Savage.
Yeah, I went through the exercise of trying to project a safety 2 deep for next year, and let's just say it got kind of ugly pretty quick. There's just not a lot of options, which is why somebody like Savage would make a ton of sense. He'd be a plug-and-play starter. This would be very much like what Oregon did last offseason, adding Evan Williams, adding Tysheen Johnson, guys that arrived at Oregon and just started every game this last season. So that's the type of player you would be getting, I guess we will say hypothetically, even though there's a lot of confidence this is happening. Matt's kind of outlined some of the background, but junior college kid, a couple of years at Kansas State, was all conference both years, was a starter and a captain both seasons. So all Big 12 second team pick in 2022, and only played, I think, 9 or 10 games, which sort of speaks to the impact he made when he did play in those games. Oregon's had a difficult time in certain matchups at the back end. And I will say Savage is probably better as somebody in the box, and I think he played a little bit more there at Kansas State than he did as a true deep safety. But this guy's really dynamic, really athletic, makes a lot of plays, had 6 interceptions in 2 seasons, and is certainly somebody who is not like a massive liability at the back end. And frankly, I don't know if Oregon safeties were massive liabilities as much as they went up against matchup against Washington twice this season. That really just going to challenge just about any college personnel at the back end of those positions. So I think the Oregon secondary stinks narrative has been too strong in the last couple weeks. I understand it's fresh because the 2 games you lost this season were to Washington, and there were some deficiencies there. I think they're going to be just fine at this position, assuming they land the caliber of player like Kobe Savage. And I think they're going to have to land a couple. I don't think they're done at safety in the portal this cycle. I don't think it would make much sense, because if you look at it, you'd be going like, I guess, are you moving Tysheen deep? Are you figuring Cole Martin is ready to start? Are you thinking someone like Cody DeCambro is going to be in the 2 deep? Because those are the type of scenarios that would be accurate and ring true for 2024, assuming Oregon doesn't go out and land another portal safety this cycle. So I think Savage is a great get. I saw Matt referenced it. There were some people who right after maybe it was just one on our message board, had some very strong opinions that this was not a good addition. That person was basically not well received by anybody on the message board. We'll put it that way. I happen to very strongly disagree with that stance. I think this is a really nice addition, and similar, like I said, to Taishim and Evan. I think this guy comes in, assuming he does end up committing to Oregon and signing for 12 games. Success, Jared?
We got it. We're here.
Hey,
we're live in the flesh. We're on our test. To go on the Savage point, just to jump in and kind of commandeer this conversation. I really like the addition. Like what Eric went through and talking about how they don't have any safeties. And if you don't believe me, go look at my depth chart for the bowl game, because after Damon David and Brian Addison decided that they're not going to play for Oregon anymore, I have Cole Martin as a backup for all three positions in the safety level, because, well, that's where they're at. It's either him, Cody DeCamper, or Tyler Turner, or maybe Kamari Terrell. I still am really honestly unsure what position he really plays on the football field. But he could be a name that goes over to safety. But to talk about Savage, I think his ball skills are a little bit better than Evan Williams's. And there have been a lot of people who compare him to Evan Williams. And for some reason, that narrative has become a negative connotation in recent weeks. And I don't get it. Like, Evan Williams is quite a good player. He was very good for Oregon this year. Like a second team All Pac-12 player, and Savage is a second team All Big 12 player, which is good. I don't know why these are almost like negative traits for a player to have, but it's beyond me. I think if he comes in and replicates what Evan Williams did this past season, I think you take that 100 times out of 100. Those are two very good players. They're two very talented players. I think there are some similarities with the two of them. I think they're both physical. I think Evan is probably a little bit built bigger, but I think Kobe Savage has better ball skills. I'm interested to see where he plays. Like Eric was talking about, maybe he plays that nickel position, and then move Taishim to the back end. But then again, there's no height. Everybody's short. They're all like 5'11" or under. Like,
that's the problem.
No disrespect to anybody who is, but that's the problem. You need guys like a Brian Addison who has that 6'4", 6'5" wingspan, or not wingspan height, and then a big wingspan that can cover range like a center fielder in baseball. But maybe they have that already coming in Sione Laulea, and their cornerback prospect, their JUCO guy, who is listed as a cornerback, but is also 6'4", 185 pounds. So maybe he's an option that can move to safety. I think Savage is a great start if they do land him. I'm assuming they will, because that's just what it sounds like. But I think it's a good start, but they need to add a couple more guys. And there's still time. There's still bowl games to happen. There's still guys to enter the transfer portal. There's bigger names entering every day. Malachi Nelson and Damani Jackson both left USC in the last 14 hours. So there's going to be names that pop up, but safety is a big priority, and I think Savage certainly eliminates some need for it. I think he's a day one starter when he gets to Oregon.
To just touch on they need to add more. They also have Aaron Flowers, a 4-star safety from Texas, and I know
right.
Like it's not a good thing if your position group and you're an elite program like Oregon and a true freshman can come in and immediately start. But Flowers is a guy, at least, that in Texas has performed very well. Mike Roach, who covers that area for 24/7 Sports, has basically been on like a year-long just love fest of Aaron Flowers, and has been impressed with him every single time that he has watched him play. He played very deep into the state the state championship playoffs in the state of Texas. Maybe Oregon is just very confident that between adding a Savage and a couple of the guys that they've got committed in this class, that they can come in and make some kind of impact. I don't know if it would be fair to expect Flowers to start, but it might be an expectation that, hey, like maybe Cole Martin in year 2 elevates himself to some kind of starter role and improves his skill set, and then Flowers replaces what Cole Martin was in 2024. Is that good enough? I don't know. Probably not, but you still have to probably go out and add some safety depth from the portal. But at least they're going to have a couple options now, and it becomes a deal where can you go out and can you add a couple more to the mix? Now, I think the big question from this past weekend that's left is what's the fallout from a Dante Moore, a Caden Green. There's also Derek Harmon, who was on campus, if you're unfamiliar with who Green or Harmon are. Caden Green is probably the number one offensive line transfer portal player in the country. He was from Oklahoma, a freshman. Missouri. He also checked out Missouri. He's from Missouri. We'll see how much of a factor that plays in. And then Derek Harmon is a 2-year starter at Michigan State at defensive tackle, nose tackle type player. He's currently unranked, but that will change. I would imagine he's probably going to be maybe like a high to mid 3-star guy. But one position that I don't know if we ever said they had to go out and find in offensive line and Caden Green, but in defensive line, we talked about this last week, the week before, the week after that, the week before that. Derek Harmon is probably one of Oregon's more important targets to hopefully land, just because of how much depth that they don't have next season at that position.
Yeah, we talked about defensive line. That's a primary position. That's the primary position in my mind this cycle. And I know Jared said 5 to 7. I think 3 to 5. Regardless, they have to get a bunch of bodies here, and Harmon would be a great place to start. Caden Green would come in and be a starter immediately. Obviously, I think he's the 4th-ranked player in the portal by 24/7 Sports, regardless of position. You said it, Matt. Top-ranked offensive lineman, freshman All-American last year at Oklahoma. This is a guy you would bring in and expect to be probably replacing Stephen Jones at right guard. It sounds like Green might want to play tackle eventually. I think maybe you could just promise him that he'd be one of your starting tackles or have a great chance at that in come 2025. And then the Dante Moore of it all is we've already kind of talked that one through before. You can be skeptical of what he was at UCLA, but if you look at him and say, hey, this is a guy who was an incredible recruit that Oregon fans obviously were devastated to lose last cycle, he would be in the mix to be the starter following Dylan Gabriel, and probably not even in the mix. I think you'd say more than that. He would be the heir apparent. And I think just to have a pretty clear-cut quarterback situation for 2 or 3 seasons, if this is how it plays out, that's a really nice place to be, to say, hey, we know we have our short-term guy in Dylan Gabriel, and then we also have our long-term option in Dante Moore. And I know Oregon fans will say, well, wasn't that what they just had with Ty Thompson? And the answer was probably not. I think sadly there was a sense behind the scenes that maybe Ty was never going to be the guy. And I don't say that because I felt that way. I say that because look how this has played out, where they saw an opportunity to go grab someone like Dante Moore and chose to go that route rather than relying on the guy who's been here for 3 seasons. So that part of it, if that comes to fruition, would be really, really exciting, as would the addition of any of those players you mentioned, Matt, talking about addressing positions of need with Harmon. And then, of course, I've already said it with Caden Green. That's a guy who comes in and starts right away in 24. And then in 25, he might be your best offensive lineman. So, this would be a huge, huge collection if they can land all 3 of those guys. But even getting 2 of those guys or 1 of those guys would be big additions for this program in terms of the direction that they're trying to go in.
Yeah, they would most certainly all be big additions. I think Green is almost like a luxury purchase at this point because of the guys that they have in their offensive line room. I think they have good depth. I think they have good talent at tackle and at guard. But to Eric's point, Green would be an immediate starter, no questions asked. I think he would be better than Dave Aiuli. I think he would be better than Kavika Rogers or whoever else they wanted to throw in there. And that's not saying that those guys are bad, because those are some of the higher snap receivers on the team at the offensive line, other than the starters. But Caden Green is number 4 overall in the transfer portal, number 1 offensive tackle. Again, yeah, like a total luxury thing, but I certainly wouldn't be against it if Oregon can get him. And maybe Dylan Gabriel is the leading, the driving force behind that in their time at Oklahoma together last season. So that certainly helps Oregon if that's the case. If Gabriel is the one who's driving that bus towards trying to get Green, but I think Derek Harmon would be a must-have. I think he's a big enough body. He's a multi-year starter in the Big Ten at Michigan State. Knows what it's like to be in big boy football situations. Oregon had a couple of guys on their roster this year. They are gone. 5 of the 8 projected linemen in my 2 deep this morning are going to be gone after the end of the season. No questions asked. They just don't have eligibility anymore. And it could be 6 if Jordan Birch is another guy who ends up leaving. He still has a draft decision to make, but he's practicing with the team as we speak. So there are needs at the defensive lineman position, and that's why I've been so high on it. And Harmon is a guy who's 6 foot. What is he? He's 6'5", 320 pounds. I think that's what he's listed at. Yeah, 6'5", 320. It's a big boy. That's what you need when you're moving into the Big Ten and you're going against the Ohio States, the Michigans, the Nebraskas, blah, blah, blahs of the world. You're going to need big boys, and I think that he would be a wonderful addition to the defensive line room. They obviously still need many more to go in that D-line room or need guys to really step up in the offseason, but he would be a good start. And Dante Moore, I mean, I've been over it. We've all been over it, I think. Like, would be a great addition, almost, again, like kind of a luxury purchase, but it would set you up for the next 3 years. You have Gabriel year 1, and then more potentially for 2 or more for at least another 1, so you don't have to worry about going to the transfer portal yet again. I think that'd all be wonderful additions. We'll see, just because it's a transfer portal, and guys. I like Lincoln Riley 2 weeks ago was talking about how great Malachi Nelson was during practice and how he could be the savior, or not the savior, but the future of USC football headed down the line, and then he's gone. So position guys, coaches can move. Like there's so many things that can happen during the next couple of weeks of the portal. I think it's really important that Oregon has gotten all these guys before the dead period. I think that was very clearly like, hey, we need to get as many people that we know that we want here. And I think they did that. I think there's probably a ship or 2 that has sailed, but just getting them out there on the first visit still puts them in the game, still gives them contacts, still gives them relationships, because this isn't like recruiting where you have relationships with these players for 3 to 4 years and then get them to campus. These are guys that like Jay Harris. I don't know what the relationship was there at Oregon, but he's a D2 player. He comes for a visit. You know him like for just a few weeks of talking as soon as they enter the portal. So just to get the connections and get the establishment there, I think is huge and important, especially before the dead period. But we'll see who they land.
Real quick, one more name just to keep your eye on. Atticus Sappington, a former Oregon State Beaver, no less, in-state kid, kicker. He was on campus, transfer portal kicker. We're not surprised, right? Like,
no,
not necessarily that it's Atticus Sappington, but the fact that they're going after a kicker, like this makes total sense. And I know they've got scholarship specialists on the team already, but if a guy of Sappington's caliber wants to continue his drive south down I-5 and land at Oregon after spending a couple years at Oregon State, you do it. He was 13 of 14 this past season on field goals. He played his prep football at Central Catholic High School up in Portland. That doesn't really matter much, but just tells you it's a kid from close to home on campus as well for an official visit.
I hope they land him so you have to pronounce his name with high frequency in the future. It's a tough one. Atticus Sappington. It's also fun to say.
Yes.
But in all sincerity, yeah, this would be. They need to figure out what they're going to do at kicker. I know Grant Meters was a really highly regarded prospect when he was coming out of high school this last year. We don't know what they have there. It really hasn't been tested. Bringing in some competition makes a ton of sense. And Sappington is somebody who has legitimate college kicking experience and has been extremely accurate. So sign me up if that one is a possibility.
Yeah. It could be a situation where they just don't have the faith in Grant Meters or just want some backup to him. Oregon has never been shy to take a plethora of kickers on their team. Mm-hmm. And this might be another instance of that opportunity. I'm just curious if it would be a scholarship guy or not, because that's been a competition. Like whoever wins the starting job out of camp is the scholarship guy. So could just be another competition piece to add. But I'm not surprised. I think it was my wild card on transfer portal ideas or players that they want to pick on. I think kicker was my wild card. Like I didn't know what they were going to do, but it seems like they are interested in adding another kicker.
Real quick, do we want to just touch on the high school class here for a little bit?
Yeah.
The original signing day for the high school kids is on the 20th, a couple of days from now. Some of the players have already publicly said when they're signing. Tion Gray, a four-star defensive lineman from Missouri, has actually already signed his paperwork and is literally just waiting until the window opens to send it in. A couple guys have already done it. Luke Moga, the three-star quarterback, has already said that he will be arriving probably in the next week or so after Christmas to join the team ahead of its bowl preparations for the Fiesta Bowl. A large group of these guys are going to enroll early. That's a huge deal. But Oregon's also trying to hold on to some guys late. Colorado is going after Jaquan McRoy. We know that Dylan Williams, Dylan Gresham, two guys have this past couple of weeks have taken official visits to Arizona, to USC. I believe Gresham was at Texas this past weekend. So Oregon's got a top 10 class. They have addressed plenty of needs. They have 2 5-stars currently committed to its roster, but they're also trying to hold on to some commitments. They're trying themselves to flip some guys as well that are committed to other schools. And then there's a couple last-minute guys who just haven't made their commitments and will do so in the next couple of days, and they're trying to land them. I guess just overarching theme, what do we like about this class? What is a player that we like about this class?
Oh, I thought we were doing like what questions we have.
What question do you have?
My question is just where is this going at receiver? We've talked about this before where, Matt kind of even touched on it earlier with the Aaron Flowers conversation at safety, where you go, okay, how much impact do you expect to get out of these true freshmen? And if you're not going to get it very quickly, you're just going to recruit over those guys. So how much of that is going into the decision-making process of like, because we've seen, we should know, Jordan Anderson decommitted in the last week or so. We've seen, Dylan Gresham potentially looking around, and maybe he ends up somewhere else. So there's 2 of these guys who, and previously I'm going to blank on the name, but there was a East Coast commit, and this was months ago, that decommitted who'd been
Tyser Denmark.
Thank you, Tyser Denmark. Yeah, I couldn't remember the first name. So they've had some they've lost a couple of receivers. I'm not particularly concerned with any of this because I don't expect true freshmen to really make massive contributions. Shoot, we just saw 5-star Jurion Dickey basically not carve out a role of any kind over the course of an entire season, and he's much more highly thought of than any of these guys. But I guess my question here is just like, what is the strategy in terms of depth building and roster building at receiver in some of these positions where it seems like Oregon has just gone out and hit the portal, and maybe it's all the positions, frankly. And so like, it seems like they're pretty okay losing some of these prep guys. And I think I'd be okay losing some of these prep guys. And it seems like I'll be very curious just to see what the future of prep recruiting holds at schools, because it's going to be, I think, at some point kind of difficult to say, hey, come to this school when in 2 or 3 years your time to potentially start arrives. Are you going to want to be patient enough to be here for that? And if you are, and you don't develop, you're not going to have the job. So I think that's the part that's kind of interesting here. And then the other part for me with some of these receivers are losing is I wonder how much of this is Jeremiah McClellan related, who is the Ohio State receiver, top 50 guy. I know Stu Wiltfong had an update on Sunday at some point, I think it was, kind of indicating that McClellan to Oregon was certainly something that could happen on early signing day. So a long-winded way of saying there's just a lot of moving parts at receiver in this cycle. I'm curious about it. And then big picture, I'm just curious about how influential prep recruiting really ends up being. It's kind of like a bigger talking point, maybe when we hit this offseason more, when we see what the portal additions look like. But I just think it's fascinating. Oregon brings in these highly rated guys and they don't play, and then they end up transferring, but then they replace them with, like, I personally think Dante Dowdell, Jay Harris, like, just to bring it back to that one, you're getting a more experienced guy in Harris who's proven he can run at the Division II level and at the college level. So it makes sense as a trade, if you will. I'm just curious to see kind of how much of that sort of thinking continues over the course of these cycles, because it just strikes me as interesting with this one in particular.
Yeah, it certainly does. That was one of the main questions that I had going into the class. I think some of those could be answered if there are some transfer portal additions, if there is the Jeremiah McClellan flip that could be on the table. But the transfer portal, like right now, there's not a whole lot of really talented wide receivers, and a couple of the ones that were really talented that either had an Oregon offer or were expected to visit Oregon have now committed elsewhere. So that pool is getting smaller, but again, there's still plenty of time left in the transfer portal. There's going to be another wave of players who join after their bowl game. I think my question sits on the offensive line. It's just, this is like 2 straight years of some more developmental offensive linemen. Fox Crater, I think, is a guy who won't take as much time to develop. Devin Brooks is another guy who's certainly risen through the recruiting rankings over the course of the year from Oregon. And then Trent Ferguson is another guy who seems like he's a real developmental guy, that he's big body, just hasn't played football for a while. He was more of a basketball player. And then someone was like, hey, come on the field, you're ginormous. He's like, all right, makes sense. So like a lot of developmental guys, and I know that this wasn't the strongest of offensive line classes. We had Cooper Patagna on months ago, and he basically was like, no one's that good, and that's okay. And so they didn't get Brandon Baker, a legacy of Oregon with his older brother Gary coming to the Ducks. They missed out on Jordan Seaton to Colorado. I don't know if I would close the door on that one yet. There's just been a lot of like Jordan and Oregon are still in contact stuff from national guys from all over the place. So I don't know if that's one to certainly close. That could be a signing day. We all remember last year's signing day when Oregon was like, well, this is seemingly maybe a disappointing class. Like they need to get a couple more guys. Then they flipped some dudes like Mateo for 6 hours, Peyton Bowen, Solomon Davis, another depth piece that Oregon had, a good depth piece at that. Like there are always going to be fireworks on National Signing Day. It's like death, taxes, National Signing Day, fireworks, some type of flip or anything. It could involve Oregon, could involve a player on Oregon's team currently, or not team, but the recruiting class. I just think that offensive line is going to be interesting. I feel like I'll have a better idea of it next season when there are more opportunities and there's a better overall class, at least from what it looks like right now. But Jaquan McCroy is no consolation prize. Like he's a legit dude, and they got on him early, and now there's a huge disparity between his rankings and the top 247 in the composite. Now those have tightened, and he's just like a universal consensus, like top 150 prospect. So that's a guy who can come in and potentially be an immediate impact player. He could be someone like George Silva, where he needs a year of development and a weight room to really figure out his body and his role at the collegiate level. But I think that's my biggest question. And it's not a knock at Alik Terry. It's just, this is the first year with him as like the full-time recruiting guy. Wasn't a great class to recruit from. I'm just interested to see where it goes from here on out. But I like that they got a couple of developmental guys, some in-state kids, keep that connection going, which you have to do, even if they're not, not the most talented kids in the world. You got to keep the in-state going. And they did exactly that, and they still landed with the top, 4-star prospect in McCroy. So just interested, but I like the class overall. I think it's got a lot of depth in a lot of different areas, probably other than wide receiver.
I think to Eric's question of will there be some attrition within this class, I think that's pretty probable, because they're at 85 guys now with Jay Harris joining the roster. We're assuming that Kobe Savage is going to commit to Oregon. That puts them one over. We're assuming that they land Jericho Johnson. Now they're back 2 over. You add a Dante Moore, you add maybe a Hickman, and all of a sudden you're creeping up towards 90. And to what you guys have said, like what's the likelihood of a true freshman showing up and performing over the next couple of seasons over adding a portal guy who was already played a couple seasons or maybe has one more year of eligibility left? Most often not at this point in time, unless you're like a 5-star top 50 type player, like you're going to pick the college player over the high school player. And for like a 1 year or a 2 year rate, usage rate. So I think there is, and that's probably what it is for me, is there is probably going to be some decommitments. There are guys that could potentially transfer out of the program to help get Oregon down below that 85 limit. And there will be guys that transfer out after Oregon's bowl game on the 1st. They will be very quickly put into the portal on the 2nd before the portal closes, I think the day after that. But I don't know if there's going to be enough portal departures to get Oregon to a number for the area of players that they want to sign from a high school ranks and from the portal themselves, which leads you to, well, look, there's probably going to be some guys that are on this commit list that don't end up signing with Oregon. And that's the reality of it. And to maybe not necessarily end on a negative note, I do think Oregon's going to flip somebody on signing day. Whether it's like what you guys talked about with Jeremiah McClellan, maybe they're trying they are trying with Jordan Seaton. Maybe that doesn't seem very realistic right now, but that's still out there. We do know that they were also at Ryan Pelham's high school, 3 days before this past weekend. A 4-star receiver committed to USC. Oregon and USC were his finalists before he picked the Trojans. And if you're unfamiliar, yes, he is Don Pelham's nephew. So there is like some long-standing connection with Ryan Pelham. And that would go into both of what you guys talked about. Like, what are they doing at receiver? That could factor in here as well. Maybe if they don't get McClellan, maybe they try real hard to flip Pelham. But it's an interesting one. I think there's a lot of questions. We're going to get some of these answers, but I also think we leave signing day still wondering about some of this stuff.
And just to end it on a positive, if Jericho Johnson commits to Oregon on signing day, and that is, I think, the expectation right now, all the crystal balls are pointed in that direction. What an incredible defensive line haul for Oregon. And this would only be rivaled by the DeForest Buckner, Eric Armstead class. This year's class would be more highly rated. I'm just bringing those up because those are two future, they ended up being top 10 draft picks. But this group could be something absolutely special. And we talked about earlier about, I did at least the kind of quandary of, okay, do you go true freshman who probably isn't going to play, or do you bring in a portal guy, and how that can cause issues? I think there's a chance at defensive line that going forward after this cycle, that they don't need to really hit the portal as hard if these players pan out. If Jericho Johnson, if Aiden Breland and Elijah Rushing, honestly, like Jackson Jones is somebody that intrigues me as just kind of an outside linebacker guy. Yeah. I just think there's so much upside in this cycle where if you hit on 3 or 4 of these guys, you could come into a spot here where we're talking, and of course, there's not going to be as many players lost to graduation after 24 on the defensive line, but where we could sit here and be saying maybe they only need to get 1 or 2 defensive line portal guys, which would be kind of a strange year just because of how much depth and how good they feel about stacking 2 really high-end defensive line classes on top of each other back to back.
Yeah, to go back to the scholarship numbers, I feel like I'm on repeat here on a lot of this as I was last year. Like I don't know if I'd worry about him right now. I looked it up. You want to know how many scholarships Oregon was at on January 10th after the transfer portal closed?
Last
93.
Year, it was right around, I think 90. Yeah, I'll say 92.
95, even more. There's 10 more over. Like you only have to hit 85 by fall. And
yeah, right.
I think they'll do it. I think it's dramatically different this year, pre-bowl game transfer out from the team as it is this year. Last year, there were a lot of people who transferred out, and Oregon didn't even land a lot of their commitments from the transfer portal until the middle of January. So they're putting in work early. There's not as many guys who have left. There's still 9 players who have left the team, which is still a good amount of people. I just expect there to be a good amount more after the bowl game and before the other transfer portal before the spring transfer portal. There's still time. But overall, I'll end it on a high note as well. There are still plenty of options out there. We haven't talked about Gatlin Bear. He's another guy who's a high 4-star recruit. He will be going on a 2-year mission. So I don't remember how missions work for their scholarship totals. I think it only counts when they come to school, when they enroll. So he wouldn't go immediately on this class, but he would be a guy for the future that you could look forward to. There's still, like Eric mentioned, the Jericho Johnson effect. I think for a while, he was my number 1 want in the recruiting world just because of his pure size, speed, and athleticism. I think he would be a huge help in the Big Ten to have a real nose tackle, a real interior fella to pair along with potentially Derek Harmon from Michigan State. I really like the class overall. I think the depth is great. I think the secondary talent is outstanding. They like Dakota Fields is their highest rated secondary guy. I think I'm in love with Ife Obadegwu. I think he's so good. I think he's a tremendous corner who's a guy who can cover strong, hit well. He's like right at the top of my list. Jackson Jones is another guy. He kind of reminds me of the Blake Purchase effect that I had last year. Like how I really liked him. I feel the same about Jackson Jones and his talent and his just pure athleticism. I think it's one of the better classes in recent memory. It's not going to be it probably won't compete for the greatest class in Oregon history. It's going to be close-ish, I think, by the end of it all. But, man, I really like the top-end talent.
You mean in terms of ranking?
Great. Yeah, in terms of like the composite score.
Gotcha.
And things like that. Because that 21 classes is pretty up there in composite ranking. I think it could get close. I actually don't know what Oregon's is right now to talk about. But I think – regardless, it's still the top end talent in this class is going to be incredible.
Real quick, Gatlin Bear has postponed. He's not signing on signing day this week.
He's going in February. Yeah. My bad, I forgot to mention.
But that's good for Oregon because they are perceived as the second school behind Michigan. So the fact that he's choosing not to sign is a positive for Oregon just because it opens the door for them to be able to recruit him longer before he signs with the school.
Not to mention, are we confident Michigan's coaching situation will be the same when February comes around? Right? Like that's certainly. I mean, we've seen that name, by the way, linked to the head coaching position for one Justin Herbert's NFL team. So it's possible Jim Harbaugh is not at Michigan, and maybe that changes some of the decision-making for Mr. Bear.
All right, that's going to do it for us here on the podcast. Next time you hear from us will probably be Wednesday at some point. We're working on a very special guest that day, as well as a couple other things. It might be a 2-podcast day, to be honest with you. I'm not quite sure what we've got planned if everything falls correctly. But if it does, it could be a pretty fun day for the pod. But until then, you've been listening to the Autzen Audibles Podcast.
Talk to you later, folks.
Peace.